Are we live?
We are indeed.
Calling Chris Anderson in Luxembourg.
This is Luxembourg calling Rick Beyer in Chicago.
Here, you're in Chicago. Where are you in Luxembourg, Chris?
I'm in beautiful downtown Clairvaux, believe it or not, leading a Battle of the Bulge tour.
How's it going?
It's going great. It's so good to actually be back here and be back on the battlefields and talking history. And
it sounds amazing.
It's good to be back.
It sounds amazing. Well, we want to welcome everyone to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, no doubt related to your visit to Luxembourg. Chris and I might be traveling the globe, but we're always here on Sundays to have a cocktail and chat some history with you. And we want to thank everybody who has been supporting our effort via Patreon, and we really appreciate your assistance in bringing the show to people. And you may notice, Chris, and our viewers might notice a new look this week.
I have.
And
where did this new look come from?
History Hour. History Happy Hour in blue. And this is our new look from our new website. And if you guys want to check out the new website, you can go and do that at historyhappyhour.net. But we are in a new look this week. And Chris, I also saw this week that Chris Wallace, History Happy Hour, two-time guest, is leaving.
And Fox News host, yeah.
Well, up until this morning, that he has done his last show. He's leaving Fox News.
And so you emailed him and said we would consider him for an interview.
Well, I thought a backup reserve host.
Reserve host, Chris Wallace.
He said he wanted to do something new, so I will assume that he's going to give us a ring sometime soon. I'll keep an eye on the phone.
Keep us updated.
I want to be on top of that. Have we killed enough time, Chris?
I think we probably have.
I think we should. So why don't you give me the cue and we'll get to it.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. Chris, 80 years ago this week, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, which you probably knew. And that week from December 6th to December 12th was a week that changed the world, and it's the subject of a new book that is out called Hitler's American Gamble by Brendan Sims and Charles Laderman. And it's a new and different look at Pearl Harbor, putting it in the context of world events, looking at that week hour by hour to see how things unfold, with the understanding that nothing is set in stone and there's many directions that things can go. And so we want to welcome on the show today the authors of that book, Brendan Sims, a history professor at the University of Cambridge, and Charlie Laderman, a lecturer in international history in the War Studies Department at King's College in London, who is also joining us from California. So we are really spanning the globe here.
This is impressive.
Guys, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you.
Great, thanks for having us.
Oh, thanks for joining us.
We're delighted, and I brought my cocktail. Chris, I saw that Chris is in a hotel lounge. They're serving him things. It's really unfair. Charlie's got a beer there, so we're all in good shape. I heard some tea. You have a drink there too. I thought there was a tea set, Brendan, that I heard there. But in any case. Look, let's start out, Brendan and Charlie. You did a deep dive into these 7 days. I mean, you've really tightly focused this book on kind of 1 week in time, and you suggest pretty strongly that they've been misremembered by history. So how have they been misremembered, and why did you decide that this was important to write about?
Thanks, Rick. Well, our sense really was that there was, right from the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, so during the Second World War, the narrative sort of entered the public realm that December the 7th settled pretty much everything, that there was a sense of inevitability from the moment that Japan struck Pearl Harbor, that the United States would enter the Second World War as a full-scale belligerent. And the more that we sort of tried to go back into time to understand what went on during that week, it was clear just how much uncertainty still existed in the minutes, hours, and days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So that's something which we wanted to recapture. We felt it was important, and we felt that it was actually extremely interesting the way in which memory has influenced the way in which things have, and the way in which history has been told. And I think one of the reasons for that is because we know the outcome, and it's often the case in history when we're looking back. We know what happened. We know that the Axis powers were destroyed, and that they were done so with the full power and the full influence of the Allies, with the United States at the forefront of that. And as a result, that sort of shaped the way in which we've seen things. And our sense was that actually that isn't the case. There's quite a lot of sort of psychological literature. Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning economist, has written a bit about this, the way in which the outcomes influence our sense of how things came about. So we wanted to recapture that. We think that played a big role in why we remember it as we do. And I think the other reason why the history has been remembered as it has been is because December the 7th has sort of entered the sort of broader understanding that this is the end of American isolationism. The United States, after that date, was going to become a full international player, a leader of the international system, and that December the 7th was the moment that happened. And our sense was that wasn't really how things were understood and experienced at the time.
So,
I was going to say, Brendan, did you want to throw in anything in on that?
Yeah, I obviously completely go with that. And
that's good. That's good that you guys agree.
Good start. But I think I would add only that a really important aspect is that the U.S. entry into the war actually takes place 4 days later. I'm sure we'll come on to that in greater detail, but the meta point we were trying to get across in the book is that the idea that the United States entered the Second World War on the 7th of December is mistaken, because what you have on the 7th of December is a new war between the United States and the British Empire on one side and the Japanese Empire on the other side. The United States only enters the war, which is what people then call the European War, 4 days later, not by their own choice, but by Hitler's action. And it's those periods of 4 to 5 days of uncertainty that we look at in our book.
No, I mean, absolutely fascinating. And I kept, as I read it, kind of getting spun around in my chair going, oh my God, okay. Hadn't really thought about it this way. But Charlie, I had a question for you. Grew up, of course, read Churchill's memoirs, where he says, after the news of Pearl Harbor, he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. And I was shocked, truly shocked, that you're saying that might perhaps not be the case. And please tell me that Winston Churchill isn't making this up. Or...
Well, Churchill writes so powerfully, and those memoirs played such a role in shaping our understanding of the conflict, not just about the Pearl Harbor attack, but the whole conflict. Partly that's because the archives aren't opened for another couple of decades after Churchill writes the memoirs. So he very much, as Churchill says, famously, he says, history will judge me kindly because I intend to write it myself. And he very much does shape the narrative, the way in which people remember the Second World War in that immediate aftermath. And ultimately, it's the case that Churchill, as you say, says that he sleeps the sleep of the saved and thankful, that he knew at that moment the United States was in the war up to the neck and into the death, so we had won after all. And our sense, we wanted to go back and say, well, how much did that actually reflect his experience at the time? And our sense was that it doesn't really reflect his experience at the time. He looks exhausted across these days. Most people who see him say this, that he looks completely shattered. He's very much concerned that American supplies are going to be devoted to its war in the Pacific, that the Lend-Lease supplies, which were so crucial to Britain's war effort, were going to be embargoed and suspended, as indeed they were on the night of Pearl Harbor. So there's so many questions that are thrown up by this. And what we see across these days is that while he believes that there's a strong possibility that the United States will end up in a war with Germany, he can't be certain.
Mm-hmm. So, Brendan, in your book, you guys suggest that when Hitler declares war on the U.S., he's not being impulsive or irrational as we kind of think, well, it's Hitler, he's going to go off the handle and do something. That he is making a considered strategic decision, whether it's a good decision or a bad decision. What's the calculation that he's making that this is a good idea?
So there's a long-term and a short-term calculation. The long-term calculation is that Hitler had really been, from the start of his career in the early 1920s, preoccupied with the phenomenon of the United States, which he regarded as really the coming world power, power that was bound to be dominant by virtue of its size, its space, as he called it, its natural resources, and in particular its people, which he regarded, and this is just his view, of course, as the repository of superior racial value resulting from immigration from what he called the Anglo-Saxon space, i.e. the British Isles, but also the best elements from Germany. So he's experienced this American power at first hand during the First World War, and his great ambition is to ensure that Germany if possible, doesn't face the United States in another war, but if it does, that it will control sufficient space itself to be able to be in a position to match what he calls the Anglo-Saxon powers, the United States and the British Empire. And he feels, really after 1937, that the United States is hostile to him, that President Roosevelt, in his famous quarantine speech in Chicago, 1937, in the autumn, has targeted the German Reich along with the Japanese Empire and Mussolini's Italy as one of those states that should be quarantined, if you like, a kind of late 1930s axis of evil. So that's the deep story, that he fears the United States, he recognizes its immense innate power, but he feels that the United States is drifting away from him and in fact is increasingly hostile. And perhaps we might discuss in detail in a minute the various stages of that hostility as it evolves from the beginning of the Second World War through to the December 1941. But the proximate reasoning on the 11th of December is that he cannot allow the Japanese Empire to go down to defeat. His whole calculation is that if I'm going to not defeat the United States, he never thinks he can do that, but if I can at least outlast them or force them to an honorable draw, then I've got to ensure that the efforts of the Anglo-Saxons are drawn off in the Pacific. And also, something that Charlie alluded to earlier from the American side, as a fear of Roosevelt's, that of course was one of Hitler's hopes, that these Lend-Lease supplies, which had been flowing from the spring of 1941 to the British and subsequently to the Russians, that these would then also be diverted. So it would give him a kind of a window of opportunity, 6 to 9 months from December through to the autumn of 1942, that he could basically grab as much land in Europe as possible and create what he called a blockade-proof space, and then basically try to survive. Not very dissimilar, by the way, to the Japanese strategy, which also hinged on the idea of securing a perimeter line and then just waiting for the Americans to come at them.
Well, I mean, what strikes me is, I've read about that Japanese attitude, is both of these countries are staking their very existence almost on a war that they say, well, it might work out, it might not. Let's see what happens.
Literally on a war that you say in your book that major actors in these various countries think they cannot win.
So the Japanese are particularly clear about this. It's very striking. The assessments of Japanese industrial power in relation to the United States range between the United States being 10 times more powerful, which is what the optimists think, and 72 times more powerful, which is what the pessimists think. That might have been a bit of an exaggeration, but whichever way you look at it, it's pretty grim. And of course, we all know the famous statement from Admiral Yamamoto, where he says, if you let me loose, I will run riot for 6, maybe 12 months, but then that will be it. And he's a man who's traveled widely in the US, and he knows his potential. And I think the important point we want to make in our book is that there's a very similar assessment being made on the German side. And so what they're trying to do really is to preempt what they believe to be a US entry into the war, which is inevitable. In fact, in some ways, they feel has already taken place, because, of course, the United States is already supplying weaponry to the British Empire and to the Soviet Union, and is already attacking German submarines in the North Atlantic, and doing various other things on the political front, which is inimical to the German Reich. Now, don't get us wrong. Both Charlie and I, of course, are absolutely delighted that President Roosevelt took this view, which was the only possible response to Hitler. But what we're trying to do is to show why, from Hitler's point of view, it's understandable why he regarded the president and the United States in general as an adversary.
And just following up on that, I think one of the things that we thought was so important was to tell this story in as global a perspective as possible, because it's so important, the perceptions from each side. There's such a limited understanding in terms of knowing the capabilities of every actor, and there's also a sense to which the way the sort of prisms to which they look at it. So even if the Japanese and the Germans think that the Americans are potentially extremely powerful, there's also this sense to which they're excessively materialistic. Once the United States they don't have the sort of like the cultural underpinnings that Germany or Japan might have to fight and to continue fighting. But I think what's also fascinating as well, on that sense to which Hitler sees the American entrance into the war as inevitable. Well, if you're looking at things from London, or even if you're looking at things from the White House, that is not clearly the case. I mean, when Roosevelt was looking at opinion polls, right up to the end of November 1941, it's clear that only about a quarter at most of Americans want to recognize the existence of a state of war with Germany at that time. So I think this sense, which I think is often the case in history of this, that there's this sort of inexorable sense that the United States is moving towards intervention, and that whatever would have happened, the United States was going to enter the war as a full-scale belligerent. An American expeditionary force was going to be sent to Europe. There's just no sense of that as a definite, as something that was inevitable as you move throughout 1941. And if you're looking in London, that's very much the fears of a number of British policymakers. The sense is that Americans are being killed on the high seas in an undeclared naval war with the Germans, but Roosevelt still hasn't asked for a declaration of war. And so this sense to which Hitler might think American entrance into the war is inevitable, that's certainly not the case from the Allied side, or even necessarily from the White House.
So it's sort of like it made sense if you believed, as Hitler did, that it was inevitable, but he was wrong. Would be one way of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sense is that he's not necessarily wrong. It's just that I think the thing is that there's no he's wrong in the sense that he thinks it's inevitable and it's guaranteed that the Americans are going to come in. And we're not saying that there would have been absolutely no chance of the Americans coming in. What we're saying is that all the evidence at that time did not point inexorably towards this. And I think one of the other things that's very interesting as well, again, looking back with hindsight, we know that the American industrial base ramps up to this unprecedented degree, and that the arsenal of democracy then becomes this sort of cauldron of just sort of spewing out sort of tanks and planes in a way that no one had ever seen before. But actually, if you're looking in early to mid 1941, the American industrial base hasn't ratcheted up yet. There's a limited amount of supplies. And the question is, who's going to get those supplies? Is it going to be America's own armed forces? Is it going to be the British? Or is it going to be, as Churchill feared, the hungry guest at the table, which is the Soviet Union? So this sense to which, as I say, if you look back from 1945, the Americans produced so much that everyone gets their share on the Allied side. There's no guarantee that that's the case in 1941.
Well, let's bring in a question from a viewer. Wally Morrison here asks, it says, Hitler seemed rarely to listen to anyone. With this idea of a declaration of war on the U.S. discussed with his inner circle, or was he yet again going on his own instincts?
Yeah, so what's really interesting about this decision is that if you compare it to earlier decisions in the 1930s, it's remarkably uncontroversial. So in 1938, 1939, there are quite a few people in the military leadership who think that having another war with the British Empire and the French is not a particularly good idea. Of course, their experiences of the First World War. Again, there are people who say after Poland is defeated, attacking France will be dangerous and so on. And those who then counsel against attacking in Scandinavia and, of course, in the Balkans. But on each occasion, Hitler actually wins out. So when we're coming into the autumn of 1941, and then, of course, the period of the week we're referring to, there really isn't anybody who feels able to stand up to Hitler because he seems, by and large, so far to have been vindicated. So what you have in the German elite is a process of consultation, yes. So we show in the book that Hitler is really asking people to send in information on the iniquities of President Roosevelt, of the machinations of the Jews, that kind of thing. We can trace that fairly closely. But there's absolutely no sense of this as a decision that is being argued about. And one of the reasons for that is that some of the major stakeholders, particularly the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, feel that they are in fact already at war with the United States. And indeed, Hitler lets them off the leash a couple of days early on the 9th of December. So for the Kriegsmarine, the formal declaration of war, which means that they can now finally take the gloves off, as they put it, is merely a recognition of an existing state of affairs. And I think that goes a long way to explaining why there isn't really any discussion within the German elite at what is a momentous decision. That said, the accounts of the 11th of December, this great session in the German Reichstag in the afternoon, do suggest that there was muted applause among the generals and among some of the political leadership. Who, of course, whatever their crimes and whatever their limitations, were not conventionally stupid people. Everybody knew the power of the United States. They'd almost all of them encountered the United States in some shape or form already in the First World War. So it's understandable that they would have been uneasy, but none of that uneasiness actually communicated itself into open opposition against the decision to go to war.
Oh, so one of this sounds sort of naive, and I hope you bear with me for a second, but growing up in the United States, Pearl Harbor is a profoundly American story. It's, our fleet is attacked, we respond to the Japanese, the war in the Pacific happens, and the truly amazing, wonderful, and compelling thing about your book is you're pointing out its global implications, and it is a serious event for a whole lot of people. I want to get back and focus in on the Germans, but before I do, could you just kind of rough out for us, why is it important to say the Soviets or Italy or some of these other players? Why is it just as significant a moment for them?
And Brendan, I will say that Charlie has gotten up, and I think there's some people making noise near where he is. So if you could tackle this question, that would be awesome.
Absolutely. So it's hugely significant from the Soviet point of view, because their immediate concern is now the supply of weapons, A, from the British, and B, from the United States, going to be diverted to the Pacific? Because, of course, the British Empire is now in massive difficulties. Malaya is in the process of being overrun, Hong Kong is being attacked, and various other fronts are not looking too good either. And likewise, of course, the United States, as is well known, is absolutely on the back foot on the 8th of December. So interestingly enough, the very first thing that the new Soviet ambassador to the United States, Maxim Litvinov, who by chance arrives at this very time, the very first thing he asks Roosevelt is, does Pearl Harbor mean that you're going to send less Lend-Lease equipment our way? And Roosevelt's response is not entirely reassuring. He says, no, we will send. And then he says, but maybe we won't send so many aircraft. which is already a sign that he is about to pause. And I'll let Charlie say a little bit more in a minute about the actual suspension of Lend-Lease. If we come to Italy, of course, for the Italians, Pearl Harbor is also a massive event. And Mussolini has previously agreed to the Japanese that he will come in with the other Axis power, with Germany, and support them. But there are many people within the Italian leadership, particularly in the Italian foreign ministry, we talk about this, who are very dubious. Even people, for example, give you an example, when the Japanese ambassador to Rome is talking to Mussolini and communicating his decision, the likely decision to attack, and Mussolini is saying, yes, I'll come in and declare war. The record says that the interpreter who was moving between them was, quote, shaking like a leaf, which gives you a real sense. Wow. Here was a man who understood what it meant to go to war with the United States. And of course, that was a very widespread opinion. So this was absolutely an epochal moment for all of these actors.
Yeah.
And Charlie, you had to go plug in your computer.
Yes, I was just going to say
but you can jump in here if you can figure out what we're talking about.
You wouldn't get these technical issues in 1941, but actually one of the things I think it does show these is one of the things that I think is fascinating to look at history over such a short period, over these 5 days, is trying to know what people knew and when did they know it. Because there's a lot of, as Brendan said, a lot of material going back and forth between these capitals. And unlike today, where we could instantly be able to communicate, and obviously there are sort of telephone conversations happening, but there's a number of things, intelligence pictures, which just aren't clear. And you need to know sort of a minute by minute, hour by hour, when people knew what they did and when. And that's something which I think is striking. I think one of the things, as Brendan said, that's so important, and which I think is, it doesn't really play much of a role in most other histories of this period, mainly because people look at it on a much bigger canvas. But the American decision to suspend Lend-Lease on the night of the 7th of December is such a critical decision in these few days. And it's something which we emphasize greatly, because it's something where, as that becomes clearer and clearer what the implications are, it just leads to a huge amount of fear in the Soviet Union, but also in the British Empire as well. And one of the things that I think is particularly important. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was just only cut out there. One of the things I think is so striking is when the British start to get information about this, which takes sort of a day or two to start to filter in just what has happened with this embargo and the suspension of Lend-Lease. One of the things that I think is critical is that it's not just the materiel, which is fundamental. I mean, the fact that Britain isn't going to get tanks for the war in North Africa is critical. I mean, American tanks are so important to Britain holding the line and stopping the Germans pushing onto the Suez Canal. So that's critical in an obvious sense. What isn't so critical, which isn't so obvious, is the way in which things like commodities, chemicals, metals, these sort of things which are required in order to just build the munitions, and even things like stuff that's needed for maps, the real sort of essentials are just not going to happen because Britain is so reliant on the United States. You're reading stuff, certain chemicals, if they don't come through, then you're not going to have the material that's needed for the windows on planes, and as a result, Britain's not going to be able to have any planes that will be able to leave, will be able to fly. Radio equipment, all of these sort of things are fundamental. And what we just see across these few days when you're sitting in the supply ministries in London is just these lists that are being made and just more and more being added to it, and the fear just ramping up in London. So the sense is, from our sense, was even if Hitler had delayed this decision beyond 5 days, if this had gone on, if this uncertainty had gone on for weeks and months even, then just the consequences would have been dire for the Allies, because the possibility that Lend-Lease and the suspension would have been prolonged.
Well, one of the things that, and you just alluded to this, it's really interesting. You're trying to tell the story hour by hour. Of course, if we were doing that today, you'd look at the timestamp in everybody's email, and understand. But you've got, people are cabling across the Atlantic, stuff's being held up for 24 hours, because of deciphering or because of another country trying to prevent it. But one of the things that makes your book compelling is that you also keep coming back to how everyday people in all of the different countries involved are viewing things and reacting things as the days go by, whether they're in the current day Soviet Union or the then day Soviet Union, Germany, America, all different, England, all these different places, and we kind of get their uncertainty and their fear, in some cases their exaltation about what's going on. And one of the sources that you draw on for this, which I really found quite fascinating, is man on the street interviews done by the Library of Congress on December 8th, 1941. Not a coincidence that they went out on December 8th and said, hey, maybe this is a good time to interview people. But the day after Pearl Harbor, people from the Library of Congress go out on the street in Washington and in other places with their recording devices to ask people what they think. And they literally say to people, this is not for broadcast. We just are recording this and we're going to stick it in the library for future generations. I mean, that's literally a quote of what they say, which is like, thank you. Historians everywhere say thank you. And this audio is available online. And I'm leading up to the fact that I want to play a quote, an excerpt from an interview that you mentioned in the book. And this was recorded on December 8th in Burlington, North Carolina. And also of interest to me, it was recorded, you don't mention this in your book, but I will mention, by Fletcher Collins, a musicologist who had been recording Appalachian folk songs for the Library of Congress. So now he drags out his 25-pound Presto recording turntable in Burlington, North Carolina, to talk to people. Here's the excerpt that comes up in your book.
The Tokyo government is just a mouthpiece for Hitler anyway, and so after all, when you fight one, you're fighting the whole damn world. Yeah. And I don't believe it'll be 48 hours till there'll be a declaration of war against Germany and Italy.
Well, I believe they'll declare war on us in less than that time.
Well, it's predicted, the Knight's report, according to them, it's predicted that it'll come in 24 to 36 hours.
But Hitler has never declared war on anybody yet.
Well, so talk about what people know and when they know it. I think two interesting things about this. One is the idea, which apparently was common currency with some people, that Hitler is somehow behind Pearl Harbor. Mm-hmm. And then also just kind of in general, they have a pretty good idea of what's going on. I mean, there's a pretty accurate assessment, there a few hours, 24 hours or so after Pearl Harbor, what's going on. Maybe, Charlie, can you talk a little bit more about how the American public was viewing the things and what drove those views? I mean, like the idea that somehow Hitler is behind Pearl Harbor.
No, thank you so much for playing, because I've read the transcript. I hadn't actually heard the audio, so thank you so much to hear that. It's fascinating because, as I say, that's someone who's convinced of the sense that the Germans are going to come in. There's also other clips of other people saying, well, we're not sure. And there's also people saying, well, we could have stayed out of this war if Roosevelt had followed a different policy. There's a lot of debate still going on at this time. And I think what was fascinating to us is the way in which the administration are also trying to shape understandings in the immediate aftermath of the attack. So Franklin Roosevelt, when he calls together a delegation from Congress to the White House, he makes a statement to them where he says, rumors are coming in from the Pacific that some of the planes over Pearl Harbor had swastikas on them. And he said, well, I have no verification of this, but until something else comes up, we're going to believe it, which is an astonishing thing to say.
People are saying. People are saying
it was an astonishing thing to say, and as he knew what happened, the politicians talk, and so they went off and they spoke to journalists, and all of this was getting out to the public. You see this even in sort of more non-interventionist papers like the Chicago Tribune reporting this, but at the same time you're also getting skepticism of this, and so the New York Times, which had been a sort of a major interventionist newspaper, on the 8th, at the same time the Chicago Tribune is reporting what Roosevelt has said, although they're obviously not quoting him directly, but they're saying sort of sources are saying that sort of the German planes were involved in Pearl Harbor. The New York Times are saying they just don't think that there would be any advantage to the Germans to get involved in this. Why would the Germans want to do this? This is almost certainly an independent Japanese operation. This has got nothing to do with Germany. And you're seeing across these days people debating, trying to work out how much were the Germans involved, what does this mean for our relations with Germany. And as you say, the man on the street is a fascinating insight into this. They're hearing, you're hearing all different perspectives from this. But also, if you read the press of the time, if you're just looking at recordings of conversations, people who keep diaries at the time, there's so much uncertainty. There's so much of a sense of we just don't know what's going to happen. And as you say, there's some who, like the person you played the recording from, who did seem to understand what was going to happen and was very sort of insightful on that. But I think he was he was quite unique in being able to predict so accurately what happened.
So one of the things, I mean, there are so many ideas and issues that you bring up in the book that cause you to think about Pearl Harbor in a totally new way, and that's one of the reasons why it's such a delight to go through. And one of the things that really struck me was you talked about that connection between Pearl Harbor, events leading up to it, then the attack itself, and how that affects the fate of the Jews of Europe.
Yeah.
And I know that's an awfully big topic, and we don't have to get into all of it, but if you could just touch on that and kind of highlight that connection, because I had never even thought of that.
So the connection is one which is pretty much entirely in Hitler's mind, but that, of course, is a hugely important space, unfortunately, at this time. So Hitler's view is that the world is dominated by the Anglo-Saxon powers, by international capitalism, or plutocracy as he calls it, and international Jewry as he calls it. And these are symbiotic, really, in their relationship with each other. So his hostility to the United States and international capitalism is always bound up with his anti-Semitism and his belief that world Jewry is manipulating the Anglo-Saxon powers to fight against the German Reich. And so the way in which he tries to deal with this is to threaten Roosevelt with the fate of European Jewry. And he does this very openly for the first time in January 1939, a famous and notorious speech in the German parliament, the Reichstag, where he says, roughly speaking, and I quote, if world Jewry succeeds in once more plunging the world into a global war, then the price will be paid not by Germany, but by the Jewish people. And he repeats that, inverted commas, warning on a number of occasions after that. So he conceives, and this is a phrase he actually uses from time to time, he conceives of European Jewry as a hostage for the good behavior of the United States. So when Roosevelt, from his point of view, doesn't get the message, he then takes that out, in effect, not on European Jewry as such, because, of course, the Jews of the Soviet Union by this stage have already been largely murdered through the Einsatzgruppen in the summer and the autumn of 1941, not also the Jews of the Balkans, most of whom have been murdered, at least the ones in Serbia, also in the autumn of 1941. But in Hitler's mind, it's really Central and Western European Jews who are the hostages for America's good behavior. And these Jews, although their life is very, very difficult, although many have already been killed for one reason or another, and many have already been deported, they have not yet been systematically murdered. And the move to murder them systematically comes in the context of the war with the United States. And we know this because immediately after Hitler's declaration of war on the US on the 11th of December, that is to say on the 12th of December, the day after, Hitler convenes his political leaders in the Reich Chancellery. And he says, I warned the Jews that if there was another world war, then they would be targeted. And then he says, now the world war is here. So the world war means the war. Previously you had a European war, but the world war is the war with the United States. And now the Jews must pay the price. So the connection is, I'm afraid, very direct. Whether or not Hitler would in any case have moved to the murder of the Central and Western European Jews. Of course, it's a different question, and nobody can know that. But in his mind, the two things in the autumn of 1941 were very closely connected.
Yeah, it was a very chilling part of the book. This idea that these are hostages, and that this idea that, well, it will work because of course Roosevelt is controlled by these nebulous Jewish interests, Jewish capitalists, sort of world Jewish, conspiracy is controlling him. Therefore, this is a perfectly logical idea. If you're Adolf Hitler and have these ideas in your head. So that was pretty frightening. I wanted to ask about another element that you alluded to early in our conversation, and this is really back with Charlie, I think, because it involves the United States, which is there is the standard view of our history probably would be that isolationism. Charles Lindbergh, America First, the rallies, the opposition to war, that this goes poof on December 7th. And it's quite clear reading your book that maybe it's going poof, maybe it's starting to happen, but it's not really happening right away. And there's a lot of kind of hand-wringing and discussions and people trying to figure out what to do and what point of view to take. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
No, that's a really good way of putting it. I think it's something which is, I think the way in which we look at these things, we think these big bang moments happen and everyone fundamentally changes their mind. And actually the way in which people look back on it, that's how they capture it. So Arthur Vandenberg famously says sort of like on December the 7th, that ends isolationism for any realist. But actually, if you look at what Vandenberg's saying himself at the time and writing in his diary, there's very much a focus on Japan. There's a sense that we will go along with the administration on this, but there is no emphasis. There's actually a concern that actually that this is not about Germany as well, and that this is sort of still up in the air. And you're seeing this across these few days where so many of the America Firsters, so many of the sort of non-interventionists remain quite committed to a sense that they can limit the area of the war. Herbert Hoover says this categorically to Robert Taft. He says that Roosevelt's speech the day after Pearl Harbor is just right. He knows that others in the administration have been pushing Roosevelt to declare war on the world, as he says. And he said, I hope we can still limit the space of this war, as in we don't need to go to war with Germany as well. And you're seeing this across these days. There's a great deal of debate on this, and I do think that that's something which we did try to bring to the fore, that you can't write the history of the end of isolationism as ending on the 7th. Hitler's declaration of war is ultimately what leads to the America First Committee really giving up the ghost. And it's about half an hour after Roosevelt responds to Hitler's declaration of war by recognizing the existence of a state of war. That's when the America First Committee say, okay, we're done. Because on the night of Pearl Harbor, their response is to say that what's happened in the Pacific does not impact the way in which our relations to the war with Europe have to be. And I think that's really, really important. That they don't see this as being a moment where, and also the other thing which I think is really interesting is that even after the 11th, even after Hitler's declaration of war, they still believe that they had the better of the argument, and they believe that ultimately history will vindicate them. The sense is that this war could have been avoided. It's Roosevelt's policies that have led to this. So this is something which I think this idea to which isolationism just ends on the 7th is, I think, is a myth. And I think we tried to show that.
I would add also that, of course, we showed that Roosevelt is actually in some ways in a much worse position vis-a-vis the isolationists after December the 11th, because of course the 7th, because they accuse him of having given all their best equipment to the British and the Soviet Union. That actually the United States is in a worse position now to fight the Japanese. So he's very much in difficulties, I think, on this.
So Brendan's getting a phone call. Chris has a party going on in the background.
It's my son.
It's okay. Yes, go for it. We're handling that. But this is History Happy Hour. You never know exactly what's going to happen. And maybe, Chris, before you ask your question, is a good time to remind people that we are talking today to the authors of the book Hitler's American Gamble, Brendan Sims and Charlie Laderman. And we do appreciate it. It's a terrific book, and we appreciate their being here. We're not ending the show. We're just mentioning that and giving Brendan a little time to get back on camera. Because we do what we can for you. So, Chris, you go ahead.
No, not at all.
I think, can I just on Brendan's point
yeah.
as well? I think what's really fundamental is that I think there's also a sense to which America First, the non-interventionists, were extremely strong in the beginning of 1941, and we're not saying that their strength is as strong as it was at the end of this year. But in Roosevelt's mind, they play a major role because Roosevelt, because of his experience of having been as part of Woodrow Wilson's government of the First World War, he saw what happened to Wilson's career after the First World War. And the defeat of the League of Nations. So for Roosevelt, what's absolutely fundamental is unity. He talks about this across these days. He's talking about it afterwards. And what he wants to do, if he's going to bring the United States into the war, he has to do it with the backing, with a more or less unified nation. And the America Firsters and the non-interventionists, they are such an important source of potential disunity. And Roosevelt really believes that's something which America can't go into this war with people griping and saying, well, you've preempted this war, we didn't have to have this. It's fundamental for Roosevelt that he can bring the United States into the war united. And that's I think the fact that he doesn't believe the United States is yet united in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor is quite clear from what he says at the time and from what people say who spend time with him.
Yeah. Brendan, one of the questions I have had my entire life, and I don't know if there's a good answer or not, but maybe you can help with this. Given what Germany and Japan are risking by going to war with the United States, why does there seem to be so little coordination between the two of them? I mean, obviously the West, Britain and America are talking before they're even involved in the war, but there seems... as important as it is for both Japan and Germany, there's no coordination. Why do you think that might be?
Well, it's a very interesting point. There is considerable political coordination immediately beforehand and after in terms of mounting a united front, criticizing the Anglo-Saxons, the plutocracies, and making a statement of joint war aims, which is basically that they don't accept the division of the world as it currently exists. But as far as the military coordination is concerned, strategic coordination, you're absolutely right. There's nothing which compares even to the peacetime collaboration that you have, which begins in a serious way about 6 months beforehand between the United States and the British. And there's many reasons for that, but the principal reason is that it's just one of practicality. Both the Japanese and the Italians and the Germans recognize that their means are limited, that in fact they don't really have the capacity beyond an aspiration to link up, which would be the obvious thing to do, somewhere in the Indian Ocean. So there is a plan, which is first enunciated in January 1942, that they will divide the world roughly halfway down the Indian Ocean. But the Japanese make a brief excursion in April 1942 into the Indian Ocean and give the Royal Navy a bit of a bloody nose, but then turn back again. The Germans and Italians get absolutely nowhere near the Indian Ocean. They get no further, as we all know, than El Alamein and the Caucasus. So that's some way short. So they're just huge practical difficulties to the coordination. They can't even, with the exception of some submarines and two very daring flights organized by the Italians. There's actually no physical connection between the two of them. And Hitler recognizes this in what is a really striking phrase he utters in January 1942 when he meets with the Japanese ambassador and he's explaining what he's going to be doing in the summer of 1942. But when he comes to the overall strategy, he says, how I'm going to defeat the United States, I don't know yet, which is a real admission. It's a real admission of...
there's the plan.
Just to follow up on what Brendan said, which I completely agree with everything he said, obviously. One of the things I think that's really important about this, though, is because of the lack of coordination between the Japanese and the Germans, that sort of adds to the uncertainty on the Anglo-American side prior to December the 11th, 1941. So one of the things that we tried to do is look at the intelligence picture, what Roosevelt and Churchill know when they know it, and what's coming in from intelligence agents and in terms of intercepted cables. But one of the things that's so striking is that the Churchill was reading on about December the 9th that the Japanese ambassador is being told, this is in the days before Pearl Harbor, but Churchill doesn't read it till the 9th, that the Japanese government is telling the ambassador that basically they expect the Germans to go to war with Japan, with the United States, but they're not actually going to tell them when they're going to attack. And so and even though there's going to be no signature on the agreement yet, they just have to do it. But it's so clear from Churchill reading just how little that they won't even share this information with the Germans at that time. And just across these days, you just see this, and the Japanese are very fearful that the Germans won't do this. And it's just across the airwaves and the intelligence they're reading, they've got no guarantee that there's this close, and as Brendan says, there is no close relationship between the two. And so it sort of adds to this, well, are Germany going to sort of keep the faith? Are they actually going to act on this? Or are they going to basically leave the Japanese in the lurch?
So there are senior figures within the Japanese leadership immediately before the attack who say, Hitler's going to leave us in the lurch. He's going to make a deal with the British, and there will then be an alliance of the white powers to exclude us. And some of them still believe that in the days after Pearl Harbor. So for them, this is very much a lively issue. And bear in mind, of course, that Hitler had done the dirty before. He concluded the Nazi-Soviet pact without telling the Japanese, which led to the fall of a Japanese government in 1939. Then he'd stabbed Stalin in the back, of course, in June 1941. So Hitler's word wasn't exactly worth very much.
Standard.
And as you say, he stabbed Stalin. He stabbed Stalin in the back. He doesn't even tell the Japanese at that time either. And the Japanese have no prior understanding that the Germans are going to go into the Soviet Union. So there's no understanding really on both sides. There's such distrust even among the Axis powers.
Well, before the show today, I was emailing back and forth with our guest for next week, Dr. Robert Lyman, author of War of Empires, and we'll tease his book shortly for next week about the China, India, Burma theater. And we started emailing about your book, and you'll be happy to know that he liked it. Okay, so we'll get the suspense over right away. But he said something in his email. I asked his permission if I could put it up for the show, and he said yes. But he said, "Isn't Hitler's American Gamble fascinating?" So first of all, yes, I'm sure you all agree. And in fact, it basically sums up the Fuhrer as an incompetent strategist. To understand true strategy, i.e. at the grand level, one needs to understand how truly to defeat an enemy. Hitler never knew how to do it, which in essence was the basis of his downfall. So I wonder, how you feel about that quote, if you think that kind of captures, Hitler's American Gamble in a nutshell, or if you would go in a little different direction.
Well, I think it captures it pretty much exactly. The only thing I would add is that Hitler, in a sense, was aware of his lack of strategy or his lack of means to defeat the United States. And yet at the same time, he couldn't see in his own mind a way not to take on or to accept what he regarded as a challenge already thrown down in front of him. So in a sense, he committed suicide for fear of being murdered.
Well,
go ahead, Chris.
I want to switch gears here because this relates to a question that was asked earlier, and I want to tie it in to a question I had. One of our guests asked about kind of the sources that you use to approach this topic, because obviously there's been a lot written about Pearl Harbor. So what did you find new or get out of it? And I would add to that, it's a very complex topic. You obviously found a lot of new information.
I'm just putting up the question you mentioned.
Okay. How did you manage to do this as co-authors as opposed to one person, going out? I couldn't put up with writing a book with Rick. I think we'd probably kill
I think
each
even
other.
just 45 minutes of the show is more than we can handle on many occasions.
But I think it's such a compelling book, and when the people that are listening or watching read it, they'll feel the same way, and they're going to go say, well, how did you manage to put this together? And it's kind of a process question. So do I get to pick?
We stumped them.
They
don't know.
I know.
They don't know the answer.
It's like, okay.
Did you want to go first, or?
Well, I mean, in terms of the source material and the approach, we divided it up. My own expertise, as you probably already sensed, is very much on Hitler and on sort of mainland Europe. And Charlie did the Anglo-American side more. But we each chipped in on each other's dimensions as well. The putting it together was a lot easier than you might think, but because the book is essentially chronological, not merely day by day, but also hour by hour and sometimes even minute by minute, we were simply able to weave the different strands together. And I think that was more straightforward than if it had been thematic. As a collaboration, I don't want to speak for Charlie, but I found it very smooth. And unlike some co-authors, we're still speaking to each other.
Which is a good thing.
No, I think that's what I was saying. We could have ended up like Simon and Garfunkel, just not speaking to each other at all. I think I think in some senses there were challenges that were obviously caused by lockdown because we couldn't actually meet up at all, and but at the same time we were also confined to our homes and didn't have access. We only had what we'd already sort of assembled, and we'd had to sort of accumulate a lot of material. But I think as a result, we were able to sort of work on the sort of more collaborative elements and come up with a system that worked. And so in that sense, there were some benefits that came from the fact that we were confined as such. But I think in terms of the source material, as I said, I think some of the things have come just from focusing on aspects that haven't really been played a big role in past narratives. Just I think because people have, by completely understandably, looked on the big canvas. By looking in such a micro period, then things which might not seem important when you're looking in the round are actually very, very important at the time. So as I say, the embargo on Lend-Lease, which doesn't really play a role in most studies of this, is so critical, and there's so much material on it, and so that, and particularly on the British side, and going through the National Archives, that just the sense of fear was palpable reading those documents in the National Archives. And I think one of the other things that we tried to do, as you mentioned, is the public reaction. And a lot of this public reaction hasn't really come out yet. One of the things we used, as well as the Chronicling America Man on the Street series, is on the British side. There's huge amounts of material of diaries in terms of day-by-day diaries that people kept that we were able to access. And Brendan was able to get similar things on the German side. We were able to find quite a lot on the Japanese and on the Soviet side as well. So there's a lot of material that's out there, which I think when we initially started, I don't think we thought we were going to find so much on such a short period of time. And then we just kept finding more and more material. So.
I just finished watching the Beatles Get Back documentary, so I look forward to the documentary of your collaboration with those moments where Charlie walks out and etc. This really is the time to finish, and yet there's one question that's come up with a viewer, and I just can't help but bring it up and let him ask it here because I think it's a great question. From Jim Lattin, who is out there near you where you are, Charlie, because you're in Palo Alto and he's not far away because he's a professor at Stanford. Is there anything that Hitler could have done differently that would have changed or postponed the outcome in some meaningful way? And I think we all know what the outcome was. And I suppose that's directed at you, Brendan, but we'll let each of you guys take a shot at that before we wind this up.
Yes, there is one thing he could have done, which would have been to have done the dirty on the Japanese. to let the Japanese fight the British Empire and the Americans, not to have declared war on the United States, and then left Roosevelt with the really awkward question of how to respond. I think Charlie could perhaps elaborate on what this would have meant for Roosevelt and for the US war effort.
Yeah, I think the counterfactuals are so difficult to obviously, because you have to sort of play them out, and they're difficult to look at in their totality. But one of the things that struck me was if even if Hitler had delayed by weeks or by months, and obviously, as Brendan said, in Hitler's mind, timing was critical, and that he needed to act before he was strangled. But timing was also critical on the Anglo-American side and on the Soviet side. So if there, for any reason, Hitler had been able to delay, then Roosevelt would have been faced with a really, really difficult decision on Lend-Lease, because he was under pressure, obviously, from the US military to get that material, to get the limited material they currently had. And we see this in this dramatic way where material, tanks and planes that were already sort of put onto ships to go to the Arctic and to go to Britain are being taken off in these days, and ships are not being allowed to sail. If Hitler had delayed just for a short period of time, then those decisions would have left Roosevelt with even more of a dilemma of what to do. I mean, if you think about this, the Germans are outside Moscow. We know that obviously the tide is starting to turn, but 30 to 40% of the heavy tanks outside Moscow are British supplied. And so for any reason, when Hitler had restarted the offensive, the Russians didn't have the tanks that were coming from the West, or if the British didn't get the American tanks in North Africa, then that could have had a real material impact, and maybe would have allowed Hitler to do, as Brendan said, to gather more and more territory in order to put himself in a better position in order to negotiate. But again, because Hitler does make that decision 5 days afterwards, we'll never know exactly what would have happened. But I think these are fascinating counterfactuals.
Well, and there's a lot of them in the book, and we do want to thank Brendan Sims and Charlie Laderman for two history professors. I'm sure it's both of you are very renowned people, so we don't want to be too familiar, but we thank you for joining us. And they're the authors of the book Hitler's American Gamble, Pearl Harbor, and Germany's March to Global War. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Terrific book. Thank you.
Yeah.
And we'll chat with you when the show's over. We'll drop you out for now. And Chris, we should talk about what we're going to do next week. And we're going to speak to, as we mentioned, we cleverly did get that in a little early. Robert Lyman's going to talk to us about his book, A War of Empires, the China, Burma, India, and I'm saying it in the wrong order. Japan, India, Burma, and Britain, 1941 to 1945. And it's a story of defeat, recovery, and victory. And I think you would agree this is a theater of war that we don't pay nearly enough attention to.
Need to know more about. No.
Yeah, and so I'm excited to do that and to talk to him. And listen, if you're watching us today on YouTube, History Happy Hour YouTube, please click that little link in the lower right to subscribe. And if you're watching on Facebook, please follow us. And you can go to Patreon to help keep the History Taps open. Thank you so much for joining us today, everybody. We appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. And if you want to have an understanding of Pearl Harbor, you have to read this book. It will open your eyes in a lot of ways. So thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe, and I'll see you from London, I hope.
Yeah, when you get done with the Battle of the Bulge.
That's right. I'll get home.
All
Stay safe, everyone.